Hello and welcome to the Special Collections and Rare Books Department at Ellis Library. In this video, we are going to look at 3 manuscripts that we have here in Special Collections. Each of the manuscripts is connected in some way with a particular religious community. The oldest item that we're going to look at is a 12th century manuscript of a work by the early medieval grammarian Priscian. It comes from a Benedictine monastery in Lombok, Austria. We also have a 15th century Book of Hours from a Dominican convent in Venice, and finally an early 16th century processional from another Dominican convent near Paris.
This first book is going to take us to the Abbey of Lombok in Austria, which was founded in the year 1040 and functioned uninterrupted as a Benedictine house for an amazing span of time, 1056 to the present, with just a few years interruption during World War II. Here you're seeing the church that was refurbished around 1652 in the Baroque style. There's over 900 years of continuity here. There's an art collection, there's a school, and most importantly to us, there's a library that today has around 50,000 volumes, and that's what you're seeing here. Since Lombok Abbey was never dissolved, its library was never broken up the way libraries in England, France, and some other parts of Europe were, and many of the books are still there today. When the monastery was first starting out, the founder, who was Bishop Adalbero of Würzburg, commissioned books or asked for donations from other monastic houses, so the oldest books in the collection date back to the 9th and 10th centuries. During the 12th and 13th centuries, which is the time period we're looking at here, Lombok's library had about 80 books and a slightly larger number of liturgical books used in religious observances. That's not a small library for this time, but actually it's not a particularly large one either. But the 12th century is also when scholarship and teaching at Lombok really seem to have taken off. And this book and many others like it were probably produced to support the monastic school. The library at Lombok incorporated a scriptorium where the monks copied books for religious purposes to add to the community store of knowledge and also as a form of working prayer or study. It has been suggested that the lead scribe, a monk by the name of Gottschalk, might have been the librarian during this period. Gottschalk's work is known through several manuscripts he decorated or wrote, including the Gottschalk Antiphonary, a dedicated service book that was taken apart sometime in the 15th century and used as binding material. It has been the subject of study by manuscript scholar Lisa Fagan Davis, who located all the leaves that were still in existence and published a reconstruction of the book. The Lombok Scriptorium and the library bring me to this manuscript, which links Ellis Library to Lombok Library over a span of about 800 years. This is a copy of a Latin textbook by the medieval grammarian Priscian, who lived about 600 years before this copy was made. And grammar is an important subject of study in the Middle Ages. It formed one of the 3 foundational disciplines, which were called the trivium: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. It also formed a foundation for the teaching of Latin in monastic schools for centuries. Priscian's work on grammar is divided into 18 books. The first 16 are short and deal with word formation, sounds, and other topics, and hundreds of copies of these first 16 books still exist. But this is the second part, often called Priscian's minor work, which deals with syntax and sentence construction, and it's much scarcer than the major work, so perhaps it was not used as widely as the first 16 books were. Either way, we have good evidence that this manuscript was produced at Lombok around the middle of the 12th century. So, like I mentioned, Lisa Fagan Davis has identified the script as belonging to one of Gottschalk's principal colleagues, who we have to call Scribe B, because we don't know his real name. Scholars can recognize his handwriting in at least 10 manuscripts still in the Abbey Library, so we know he was there for a long time. He had a connection to the library, and our manuscript was definitely produced there. We can also match the tools used in the binding to the tools used on bindings still in the Lombok Library. And even more evidence, the Librarians of Lombok produced handwritten catalogs in the early 13th century and the late 18th century that describe all the manuscripts in the Abbey Library at those times. And sure enough, Priscianus Minor is on the list as manuscript 122. In a publication of the medieval catalog by Kurt Holter in 1956, he notes that this manuscript was reported missing in 1827, perhaps stolen from the Abbey Library. We don't know exactly when it left Lombok, but it did sometime before the 1840s, because by then it was owned by Sir Joseph Radcliffe, who you can see his book plate here. He built this house, Rudding Park, in that year. And in around 1824, actually, and he died in the 1840s. And that's our last stop for the manuscript before it came here. It was at some point acquired by the bookseller Hans Kraus, who sold it to the University of Missouri in 1967, and it has been here ever since.
Our second book is this 15th century Book of Hours, from the convent of Saints John and Paul in Venice. Book of Hours is a devotional text that contains a shortened form of the Divine Office, which is the daily cycle of prayers performed by members of religious orders and the clergy. The convent of Saints John and Paul, in which this Book of Hours was made, was consecrated in 1293, at the same time as the Basilica of Saints John and Paul. The basilica still exists. It is the brick church on the right of the photo that you can see. With the fall of Venice to Napoleon in 1797, religious orders were banned in the city, and the convent was therefore closed. The building that housed the convent, which is the white building on the left of the photo, was converted at that time to a military hospital and remains Venice's main hospital to this day. So how do we know that our Book of Hours comes from this particular Dominican convent in Venice? The evidence for this comes from the calendar included at the front of the book, which lists important saints' days and other Christian feasts. We can tell our book is from Venice because the patron saints of Venice, Saints George and Mark, are written in red in the calendar, as you can see in the blue box on the left. And this indicates that they are of particular importance for this book. In the calendar from another of our manuscripts, which is on the right, and this is a manuscript that's not from Venice, you can see that St. Mark, as one of the evangelists, is in red, but St. George is in plain black. And we can tell that our book is Dominican because important Dominican saints, like St. Peter Martyr, are also written in red in the calendar, as you can see in the green box on the left. In the other manuscript, which has no Dominican association, St. Peter Martyr is included in the calendar, but only in black. So we are looking for a Dominican establishment in Venice. And we can tell that our book is from the convent of Saints John and Paul in particular, because, again, their names are in red in the calendar, as you can see in the box on the left. This is despite the fact that they are two quite obscure 4th century Christian martyrs. They are not the better-known apostles John and Paul from the Bible. Only in a place with a special connection to these martyrs would they be listed as red-letter saints. In the other manuscript on the right, their names are included, but again only in black. The calendar is useful not only for working out where the book comes from, but also its date. If the calendar includes the name of a saint, we know that the book must have been made after that saint's canonization. But if the calendar misses out an important saint, we can conclude that the book was probably made before that saint was canonized. The fact that Saints Vincent Ferrer and Catherine of Siena, important Dominican saints who were canonized in 1455 and 1461, the fact that they are missing from the calendar perhaps suggests that this book was made as early as about 1450. So who used this book? By the late Middle Ages, books of hours were usually used by lay people, so it is likely that this book was made at the convent for a lay brother, who was not under vows, but was affiliated with the convent and tried to live in accordance with its rules. We can be almost certain that by about 1500 the book was in the hands of a layperson. At about that date, some additional text was added to the manuscript, and some of this text is in Italian. The inclusion of a vernacular language like Italian instead of Latin would be unexpected for a book that was to be used by a Dominican priest or friar, but it would be less unexpected if the book was to be used by a layperson. Evidence for the actual name of one of the book's owners can be found on the final leaf, where we can read Suor Serafina, Sister Serafina. This suggests that the book was no longer at the original convent, which was for men only. And finally, we can find in the book clear evidence of its use as a devotional object. One leaf, for example, has rows of stitch holes, as you can see here. These indicate that something was at some point sewn to this leaf. It's just possible that the item was a very small relic of some kind, but it's more likely that it was a separate leaf containing some sort of devotional image.
This is a processional for a Dominican sister of St. Louis at Poissy. The Dominican convent at Poissy was founded by Philip the Fair in honor of the canonization of his grandfather St. Louis in 1304. The convent sits near the banks of the Seine. Nowadays it is northwestern suburb of Paris, just 14 miles from the city center. The choice of Poissy was not random. St. Louis, King of France, was born there in 1214. Apparently it was originally intended as a royal house, open only to noble women. Thus, in 1397, Marie de Valois, daughter of Charles VI of France, entered the convent in Poissy when she was 4 years old. Her grand-aunt, Marie de Bourbon, was the abbess at that time. The convent existed for almost 500 years and was destroyed in 1792 by the French revolutionary barbarians. Dated around 1510, our manuscript was made for one of the sisters in the convent of St. Louis. Most probably it was made in Paris. The technique and palette of the miniatures remind the works of the most prolific and famous masters of that period, known as Maître de Jacques de Besançon manuscript and Maître de Jean de Billière manuscript. Usually such books were highly customized for each nun with her own coats of arms, and we find here two different ones. One is gold with a black band, the other is silver and red. The manuscript is written by one hand in a clean and highly readable textualis formata. The binding is a beautiful example of the late work of the Parisian bookbinder Le Gascon. He was active between 1620 and 1653, preferred red morocco for his bindings, and had all his ornamental tools for the gilding cut in dotted instead of solid lines. He worked for the most famous collectors of his time. The manuscript was certainly a luxury item. The cost of an illuminated manuscript on parchment was certainly striking, because the printing on paper had been well established by that time, and by the 1490s the Dominican processionals were printed in many parts of the continent. What's inside? Processional means a book containing litanies and hymns for use in religious processions, especially at the beginning of a service. The subject of the miniatures and historiated initials are as follows. It opens with the liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts, or the Mass of St. Gregory the Diologist, or the Great, served only on weekdays in Lent. Next, presentation in the temple, or it is called purification of the Virgin. According to the Mosaic law, a mother who had given birth to a man-child was considered unclean for 7 days. Moreover, she was to remain 33 days in the blood of her purification. 40 days after the birth of Christ, Virgin Mary complied with this rule of the law. She redeemed her firstborn from the temple and was purified by the prayer of Saint Simeon in the presence of Saint Anna the prophetess. Next is the resurrection of Christ, followed by the ascension of Christ. The fifth is Corpus Christi with Saint Dominic and the Bishop Saint, celebrated on May 26. Sixth is Saint Dominic with a dog, as a visual pun alluding to the Dominicanes, the dogs of the Lord, celebrated on August 8. The Assumption of the Virgin Mary, August 15th. St. Louis, celebrated on August 25th. The Nativity of the Virgin Mary, September 8. Saint Ursula, October 21st. Saint Nicholas, December 6th. Saint Catherine of Alexandria, Martyr, November 24th, 25th. And then the last, Saint Sebastian, on December 26th. We see twice Saint Dominic, as the convent is Dominican, and Saint Louis as the patron of the convent. As to the Saint Catherine, it is Saint Catherine of Alexandria, not of Siena, as one would expect, a Dominican of tertiary order, canonized in 1461, so her canonization was already known to the sisters of St. Louis. The major part of the text is devoted to the services around Great Lent and Easter. Thus, on followed 38, there is a processional text for the cleansing of the altars on Maundy Thursday. It says, Feria Quinta. In Catholic liturgy, Thursday is referred to in Latin as Feria Quinta. In Cena Domini, Table of the Lord, Ordo Altarum Abluendorum in Ecclesia Beati Ludovici de Pisiaco. This book has been acquired in England as a centennial gift for the library.
We hope you've enjoyed this video on 3 of the manuscripts that we have here in the Special Collections and Rare Books department at Ellis Library. These 3 books represent just a tiny proportion of our collection from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. We have many other manuscript codices and leaves, as well as incunables and other early printed books. You are, of course, always welcome to come to Ellis Library to see any of the books featured in this video or any of the other items in our collection.